As ham radio operators, whenever we see or hear or read a report on ham radio in the media, a lot of times it mentions John or Jane Smith, what they're doing in ham radio, and that's very well and good, be it working with satellite, contacting the International Space Station, doing emergency communications, any one of these things. They're all very well and good. Unfortunately, as hams, just mentioning that so-and-so is a ham really doesn't get you very far. But if they mention the call sign, that's a totally different story. Then it registers and they'll say, oh, I know him or her. So that makes life a lot easier. Sometimes you'll see call signs mentioned in reports, usually in print, not so much on electronic media, but usually in print. And one example of this very interesting one took place back in the 1990s during all the conflicts that were going on in Bosnia, when amateur radio was the sole link to the outside world while all the atrocities were going on. And in the New York Times, they mentioned the call sign of one of the amateur radio stations, and it was a YU4 call sign back from the days when Yugoslavia was one country. It was very interesting to see that in a publication such as the New York Times. It just goes to show how important call signs are to us, to refer to them as our fourth names, because in many cases, those of us who may work DX and make a lot of contacts, more people know us by our call sign than any other moniker. And so comes to call signs, it's a very important thing to us. It's something very near and dear. When we get the chance to choose a call sign, usually we have to put a lot of thought, energy into it, because that's how people are going to know us. That's the premise of the presentation here today. The call signs are fourth names, where they came from, how they started, and most of what we're going to talk about is the years after World War II. We'll touch upon a little bit about pre-World War I and between the wars and so forth. But there are many other resources if you really want to go into more detail on that. But I'd like to concentrate on what's happened since World War II and the major changes in the system in 1978, because that was really a watershed year for ham radio call signs. It was really like a line of demarcation, if you will, between the past and current system. As we go, we'll start the very early days of radio back to Marconi in the first decade of the 1900s. When people started experimenting with radio, everybody made up their own call signs. It could be first names, 1 to 3 letters or numbers, initials. It could be just about anything. And commercial stations pretty much did the same thing as well. It was like the wild, wild west. There was no order to it or anything. And people just did their own thing. Hiram Percy Maxim used SNY, for instance. That was about, at least 100 years before Sportsnet New York came into existence. There was no connotation there, but that's what he used as his first call sign long before he became W1AW. But in 1906, the International Radio Telegraph Convention in Berlin called for countries to license stations. In this country, it took a long time for it to come into being in the US. It wasn't ratified by the US Senate until 1912, specifically April 3rd, 1912. And it decreed that all stations were to be licensed by the federal government, and hams were limited to 200 meters and down, which back then was considered microwaves. Hard to believe, but that's what it was considered back then. And the US was assigned the prefixes WN and KC through KZ. We didn't have the entire K block until the 1920s. So that's how things were back then. Hams started using call signs in the format of a number, then 2 or 3 letters. No one gave any thought to international communication, so there were no prefixes. Everything was just a number and letters after it. No one really thought that on 200 meters and down, we'd be able to communicate internationally. Well, we learned a few things in later years, that's for sure. But some examples are 1AW, which is Hiram Percy Maxim, 2AGW, 4FRG, and so forth. X was not used. Y was used for club stations, most specifically in colleges. Even to this day, there are a few carryovers from that era, like W9YB at Purdue University, W6YX at Stanford University. Those are carryovers from this particular era. Still remnants of that system around, even though we probably don't realize it in our day-to-day work as ham radio operators. During World War I, ham radio was shut down completely. The Navy had full control of all the radio spectrum that was known at the time. All radio equipment was confiscated by the US government. Not only transmitting equipment, but receiving equipment as well. In fact, during World War I, if you had receiving equipment, you could be arrested for treason, believe it or not, in the United States. That's how strict it was back then. Thankfully, after the war, hams returned to the air, but they had completely new call signs. The old system was wiped out completely. And by the early to mid 1920s, once we established that hams could communicate across the Atlantic to foreign countries, we had a little problem. How did you know what country you were contacting? I mean, one ABC could contact two DCF, and they could be in different countries, but we had no way of knowing it. So hams were able to come up with a solution. It was a temporary one, but remnants of the solution actually carried over into the mid-1970s. The IARU, the International Amateur Radio Union, came up with something called intermediates. Instead of using DE before your call sign when you're transmitting, in the US, we would send the letter U to identify ourselves as the USA. And later that would become NU, as in North America, USA. These were not official, and when they were written, the U and the NU were written in lowercase because they were not official prefixes. Remnants of this system survived into the 1970s. Back in the late 40s, early 50s, there was AC4YN in Tibet up into the mid-1970s in the Himalayan kingdom of Sikkim, which is now a part of India. There was AC3PT, I believe he was the king of the country. That call sign continued to be used up until the mid-1970s, even though AC had been a USA prefix for quite a while. AC back at that time stood for Asia China, and that was part of the IARU intermediates that were in use from the 1920s. In fact, Bhutan, which now has the A5 prefix, also had an AC prefix. They were AC5 up until the early 1970s when they joined the ITU, and they were assigned the A5 prefix, which is what they use today. And finally, with the passage of the Radio Act in 1927, the Federal Radio Commission, or the FCC's predecessor, we adapted the W prefix for amateur radio stations. N was used by the Navy, and by that time we had the entire K block, and that was used by territories and possessions. Pretty much stayed that way up until after World War II, when amateur radio experienced unprecedented growth. And after World War II, we had another major international conference, this one in Atlantic City. Also in this country, the call areas were realigned. We had the creation of the 10th call area, which was carved out of the 9th. Before that, at least 4 states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, were carved up by call areas. In New Jersey, North Jersey was part of the 2nd call area. South Jersey was part of the 3rd call area. In Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania was the 3rd call area, and the rest of Pennsylvania was in the 8th call area. In New York, the eastern part of New York, basically the portion that's in the Hudson Division, was the 2nd call area. The rest of New York was in the 8th call area. And in Michigan, it was a little simpler than that. The lower part of Michigan was in the 8th call area. The Upper Peninsula was in the 9th call area. But after World War II, everything was realigned. States were fully in call areas. Michigan was placed in the 8th. New York and New Jersey formed the 2nd call area. Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland were the 3rd call area. And they carved out the 10th call area. And also California became the 6th call area. A couple of other states were part of the 6th call area before the war. After the war, they were made part of the 7th. That was Nevada and Utah. They were shifted from 6 to 7. So that created the call areas as we know them to this day. Back then, with all the calls starting with W, if you moved from one call area to another, you would usually get the counterpart, but not always. If it wasn't available, you'd get a different call. If you were lucky enough, you'd go from 1 to 3 and get W1 ABC and then W3 ABC. And also at that conference, we were assigned the AA through AL block of prefixes, something that would not come into play until about 30 years later. 2-letter prefixes starting with K were issued in the territories and possessions. Up until that point, they were issued single-letter K calls. So KL7 became Alaska, KH6 Hawaii, KZ5 for the Canal Zone, KP4 for Puerto Rico, and so forth. That's the way it stood. After the war, as the W calls were running low, finally K calls came into being in the contiguous 48 states. The first call area to go to K calls was the 9th call area in 1949, and the other call areas would soon follow thereafter. And then in 1951, we had the creation of the Novice license. And that was a watershed moment in ham radio. The amount of hams in this country just exploded. The Novice license, when it first started, was originally 1 year and one time only. In other words, you could only hold a Novice license once. You could never hold it again. And it limited you to 75 watts crystal control, and on the HF bands, CW only, originally 80 and 40. And then a few years later, they opened up 15 meters to novices. At that point, novices did have some phone privileges on 2 meters, but they would be taken away in the late 60s. The idea of the Novice license was basically for you to get on the HF bands, get your code speed up, and upgrade to general within 1 year. There was also the technician license coming out around that time too. And if you weren't able to do the code at 13 words a minute, the technician license could also be an option. But the idea was to upgrade to general. Quite a few novices did very well with it. They would receive WN or KM prefixes to distinguish them on the air from those who were generals and above. And the N would be eliminated upon upgrading to general. And in the outlying territories and possessions, you would get a WH or WL prefix, for example. And when you upgraded to general, the W would become a K. Very simple. And as I mentioned, the Novice license was very successful. Even in the early 1950s, several novices actually accomplished DXCC, running 75 watts in crystal control, which was quite an achievement back then. And then around 1957, K calls are running out in the 2nd and 6th call areas. FCC had a problem on their hands. Where do we go from here? Well, for a while, they just reissued the Ks and the Ws. But in 1958, they came up with a solution: 2-letter prefixes. The WA calls began appearing in 1958 in the 2nd and 6th call areas. And to avoid duplication of novice calls, they used the WV prefix in the 2nd and 6th call areas. So what that meant was if you had WV2ZOW and WN2ZOW licensed at the same time, WN2 would drop the N and become W2ZOW, while WV2ZOW would become WA2ZOW. If you really want to look at this in more detail, go look in the happenings section of May 1958 QST. There's a nice big article about it, because this was really groundbreaking at the time. Quite a sea change in terms of call signs. When they gave out the WA prefixes, you could pretty much tell when someone was licensed, which is something that you couldn't necessarily see before. And then 4 years later, in 1962, the WA prefixes were starting to run out, as both the 2nd and the 6th call areas were going through the alphabet very quickly. So WB calls first appeared in 2 and 6 land. And that brings us to something very interesting, which I call victims of geography. What do I mean by that? Well, here we go. If you lived in New York, New Jersey, or California in the 1962-63 timeframe, you would have gotten a WB call. Had you lived in an adjacent call area, 1, 3, or 7, you would have gotten a K call, not even a WA, a K call. And as an example, those poor folks in Phillipsburg were getting WBs, and if you cross the Delaware River to eastern Pennsylvania, they were getting Ks. Interesting to think about. And I know quite a few people who fit that category. In fact, an irony of ironies, I know an original WB2 from that period, and he lived in New Jersey for quite a while. Not long ago, a number of years ago, he moved out to Nevada. Had he lived out in Nevada when he got his first license in 1962, he would have been a K7. Instead, he's a WB2, now living in Nevada. So that's a bit of an irony when you think about it. It took about 4 years to go through the alphabet once again in call areas 2 and 6. So by 1967, the FCC went back to reissuing the WA and WB calls until the 1970s, when we first saw WD prefixes first making an appearance. That was something new as well. They were issued in all call areas except 1, 3, and 7. They were issued in the second call area only for a brief time in 1978. There's a reason for that, and I'll explain why. In the meantime, extra class hams were about to get an interesting perk: distinctive call signs. From 68 through 76, if you were an extra and had been licensed for 25 years, you could get a 1x2 call. But the only problem with it was you didn't get a chance to request a specific call. It was assigned randomly. So if you were a CW operator, especially if you had a good CW call that was a 1x3, you stood the risk of getting something like K2JY or K2QJ or something like that, which would be rather clumsy on CW, and you'd lose your 1x3 call. So that was one caveat in the process of it. That was something that was made available to extras in that period. That was about to change, however. In 1976, extras can now request a specific 1x2 call sign, and the N prefix was opened up to hams for this purpose. This remained in place until they changed the system in 1978. When they ran out of single letter 1x2s in the 4th and 6th call areas in that period, they started to assign AA calls for the first time on a regular basis. That was an interesting period because there were several windows of assigning the call signs at that time in 1976. The first group that had eligibility were those who had first got their extra licenses prior to incentive licensing in 1967. And then I think if you got your extra between 67 and 74, you were in the next window. And then I think 74 to 76 was the third window. And then after that was the final window. I was in the third window because I got my extra in 1975. And I changed from WA2BSU to N2SU in 1977. It led to a situation where teenagers like myself at the time were sporting 1x2 calls and N prefixes, much to the disdain of old timers. They didn't like teenagers holding 1x2 calls at the time, and N prefixes were not held in very high regard either back then. A lot of people, when they changed call signs back then, they wanted a W call. My philosophy was, when I changed my call sign, I'm going to be known by my suffix more than my prefix. And I may be a dinosaur in the sense that when I look at call signs, I look at them based on how they sound in CW, because that's where I've always done the majority of my operating. And I wanted SU because it has a very good rhythm on CW, and it came from my original call sign. So I got SU and I got the N prefix as well. And I didn't mind that at all. Even to this day, when I look at my call sign and I hear it on CW, I don't hear it as 4 letters. I hear it as one sound. And I think those of us who operate CW, whether it's 4 or 5 or 6 characters, when we hear our call sign on CW, we don't think of it as separate characters. We look at it as one particular sound. So that's how I look at it. And that's, I think, something that with the no-code licensees today, you don't see that very much anymore, because a lot of hams don't even bother with CW anymore. And as I mentioned, I was talking about WD2 calls. We'll get to that a little later, but March of 1978, the entire system changed, and it changed drastically, because now call signs would be assigned sequentially and by license class. You would not be able to request a particular call sign anymore. You got what was coming in the alphabet, and that was it. And this is how it worked. Novices would get what were called Class D calls, starting with KA, the number, and then 3 letters. Technicians and generals were considered Class C, and they started with N number AAA. Since the W's and the K's are already assigned, they didn't bother starting with that. They started with the brand new 1x3 N calls at that time. Advanced Class B calls started with KB number A1AA in one land. The reason they didn't use KA calls in the other call areas is because KA 2x2 calls were assigned to military stations in Japan. So that's why you didn't see them assigned here in the US proper. So they started with KB2AA, and they've gone through the alphabet a fair amount since then. Extra Class A calls, they started with 2x1 calls, something that we had never seen before, starting with AA2A then going to AK2Z, then going to KA2A to KA2Z, NA2A to NZ2Z, WA2A to WZ2Z, and then AA2AA, and that will go through to AK2ZZ. We haven't finished that entire series yet, but they have in the fourth call area. Fourth call area has exhausted all the 2x2s with the A prefixes. So if you want a special call sign in the fourth call area, an extra class call, a sequential one, you'll get a class B call, and they're in the KY4s at the moment. So if you, when they run out of that, they'll go to NA4AA and just go through the alphabet again. They're the only call area that's in that situation. The main thing about this system was all calls would be assigned sequentially. You didn't have any choice, and it would stay that way for a long time, for a good 18 years. Finally, in 1996, they came up with the Vanity call sign system, where you could select a call from your particular group or below that group. By that time, looking at it from an extra class point of view, a lot of 1x2 call signs became available because none had been issued in 18 years. And with attrition, silent keys, and the like, because remember, in 1978, not all 1x2 call signs were held by extras. You had a lot of old timers who were advanced, and some even generals who had 1x2 call signs back to the 1920s. So a lot more, I'd say the overall majority of those who fit that category were no longer around by 1996. That's why a lot of the 1x2s became available. There was a big rush in 1996 to grab these call signs, and that's why even today they're held at a premium, because it's the kind of thing where you really don't have much of a choice. You just have to wait for them to become available. And this is what I'm talking about with the Vanity call sign program. Back then, it cost $30. The way it was set up, every 10 years, you'd have to pay $30 to renew the Vanity call. That's how it worked back then. Eventually, you had text sporting W and K prefixes on 1x3 calls, whereas look, you might see somebody with a 1x3 K call. They were a technician, recently licensed. One of those 1x3 K calls would have dated back to the 1950s originally. Now you see a lot of new hams taking call signs. They could be initials or initials of an organization they belong to or something like that, family members, whatever the case may be. That's why you see a lot of non-extras and newer people scoring the 1x3 calls, oftentimes with W and K prefixes. And needless to say, as I said, the 1x2s disappeared very, very quickly. So we're going to take a look now at the second call area in particular, and what's happened there since the 1950s. Well, throughout most of the 1950s, we had K call. They were exhausted around 1957. And for about a year, they reissued the Ks and the Ws. In 1958, they went to the WA calls with WV novice prefixes. Once they exhausted that, they went back to the WN novice prefixes, and they issued the WBs from 62 to 66. And for the next 3 times through the alphabet, they reissued the WAs and the WBs. I got my call at WA2BSU in 71, WN2 that is, and that was the 4th time into the alphabet, and they were just reissuing them. As a side note, when I got my call WA2BSU, I went and did some research and found that that call had been held by someone in Brooklyn from 1958 to 1963. And my novice call WN2BSU was assigned to someone in Rochester, New York around 1966 and 67. So I was not the original holder of either one of those 2 calls. My current call is what you might call a virgin call. No one has ever held it in the amateur service except me, and that came in 1977. When they went through the alphabet, they finished the alphabet, the 5th go around in early 1978, and that's when the WD2 calls were issued. There aren't very many around, but there's still a few. If you see one, that's when they got their license. Sometime in early 1978, between the 1st of January and the change in March. What I'm going to go through next is, in the second call area especially, we went through the alphabet every 4 years or so. Not so much anymore. Population shifts have had a huge effect on call signs. This is a look at ham populations from the fall 1967 call book to January of this year. And when you look at the ham populations in 1967, you see that the second call area had the second highest number of hams. Today, however, it's totally different. We're number 8 when it comes to the number of hams in the 10 call areas. The most remarkable shift, look at 7. In 1967, they had the fewest number of hams and by a pretty good margin. Now they're number 2. The population of the Rocky Mountain West has just exploded. Look at Las Vegas. It was a sleepy little town 50 years ago. Yeah, they had gambling and so forth, but it's a metropolis of over 2 million people nowadays. And there are a lot more hams out there, of course. Back in the days when I was a novice and first licensed, if you heard a 7 call, you wanted to work that because if you were looking for worked all states, that was almost DX at the time because there weren't a lot of hams in the 7th call area. Nevada was a very rare state. Wyoming still is very scarce, but Idaho, Montana, they weren't easy to get either back then. The most popular states then, as they are now, are Washington and Arizona. But places like Seattle, Phoenix, Tucson, they've grown exponentially as well. So that's where the change in population has gone. When you look at other population shifts, look at the 4th call area. They have more hams by a very wide margin, 40,000. In fact, in the 9 states that comprise the 4th call area, all of them have at least 10,000 licensed hams. One with the fewest, believe it or not, is Kentucky, and they're just over 10,000. But every state in the 4th call area has at least 10,000 hams. California is right up there. The 5th call area has undergone a lot of growth. Just look at Texas. And the other call areas, 8, 9, and 0, they're kind of in the same ballpark. They're in the middle. But of course, look at the 2nd call area. We've lost a lot of population, and the 3rd and 1st call areas, they're the laggards once again. So that's had a huge effect on call signs as we take a look right here. As of the end of last year, the 4th call area is going through the alphabet faster than anybody else. This is December 30th. They're well into the W suffixes right now. Before long, probably in, you figure another month or two, they'll be going into Q4. They skip P, of course, because that's Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And that will be the beginning of the 14th alphabetical series of call signs in the 4th call area. It's kind of amazing when you think about it because it's 44 years since they changed the system to be 44 years in March. And if you divide 44 by 14, that's 3 and change. So that gives you an idea of how fast they're going through call signs in the 4th call area. Then comes the 6th call area, 7th, 5th, 0, 8. 2 is a little bit ahead of 9, and then comes 3 and 1. In fact, we just had a VE session last week, and they got calls KD2 in the YP area. Probably sometime this year, it'll take a little longer, but sometime later this year, we should go to the KE2 call signs. So the 2nd call area certainly slowed down a lot when it comes to going through the alphabet for new call signs. It's very interesting to look at. I can also talk about current calls in other countries as well, but I'll take questions here as well. If anybody has any questions about the system and has happened in the 2nd call area or whatever.